the southern states.
In this video segment, we're going to take a look at finishing the enclosure for our radio project. Now, the style that I was going for when I designed it was a 1940s radio made out of the Bakelite material, which was an early form of plastic that we use today. The colors back then, this would have been very close to a Bakelite brown, as I'll refer to it, that I've seen in radios and other consumer products of that era. I'm going to be showing you how to finish it with Createx paints. They're water-based paints. I'm trying to be more careful these days with some of the products that I use. Water-based is a lot safer than using lacquers or enamels and so forth. Of course, you're free to alter the design, the colors, etc. to suit your needs, but this should get you really close to what a 1940s radio would look like. Let's dive right in and see how much fun we can have. Well, at this stage of the game, I'm moving right along on our internet radio project. And in this video segment here, I'm going to be talking about the painting. Now, in the other video, I've gone through in pretty good detail how you prep a 3D printed object to get it ready for paint. So here I'm just going to kind of quickly go over a few of the steps that got me to this point. Before we move on to assembly and so forth, there is one step we want to take care of, and that's to install the brass threaded inserts. Now, these simply get melted into the plastic in their holes where they belong, and you use your soldering iron set at its highest temperature to slowly press them in to the plastic material. Sometimes they'll want to stick to the end of the soldering iron, so I just use my X-Acto knife to hold them in place while I retract the soldering iron and wait for the plastic to harden back up again. Now, as you know, this was designed so that it could be printed on a smaller printer. So some of the panels, such as this one, are actually 3 pieces glued together. Same thing with the base, 3 pieces glued together, and the body, 3 pieces glued together. And that was glued together with cyanoacrylate glue, and in some cases I had to use the accelerator to help the bond move along. After I got everything glued together, I did an initial sand with roughly 220 grit sandpaper. A lot of it is block sanding. You take a known flat block, put self-adhesive sandpaper on it, and then you sand the object with that. The object is not to just sand off the roughness, but to get the whole surface flat as well. So a block sander is a very good tool. This is an aluminum extrusion I picked up at a hobby store for specifically this purpose, and they come in different lengths as well. So I went through, did an initial sanding, then I went to this product from, who's it made by here? I'm not exactly sure. Smooth On is the company. The product is XTC 3D. This is I'm going to call it a finishing epoxy. You mix it together like any epoxy, and it's a fairly thin viscosity. And if you want, you can actually thin it out more with denatured alcohol. And I actually do that, and it did that in this application and other applications as well. But you just brush it on like a paint. But the really nice thing about it is it sands so good. If you've ever sanded PLA material, you know it's a nightmare to sand and get smooth. This stuff sands very easily, very good, and you can get a very silky smooth surface with it. So I use this between sanding coats. Now, working through various grits of sandpaper, I usually start with 220 on my very first, after my first epoxy coat. Then I put another epoxy coat on, and then I'll switch to 320 grit. And then I'll stay with 320 all the way through till I get the surfaces flattened and smooth. Then I'll do a final 400 grit. So where I'm at right now, I've gone through 3 applications of the epoxy on all the components except for the speaker grills. These are hidden and concealed So realistically, all I did was just do a rough sand on them. They're going to be covered in fabric, so I really am not concerned about how they look. So those are done and ready for assembly. But the back, the base, the trim, and the bezel and the body have all had 3 coats. Again, sanding after the first coat with 220 grit, second coat, 320 grit, third coat, 320 grit, and then a final 400 grit sanding. And that got us all through the whole preparatory process to get it ready for paint. Now I'll bring you in closer, and then I'm going to show you some detail of it and how I'm picking my colors for paint and why I plan to paint it. Now, as you can see, it's very smooth. I took a lot of attention, or paid a lot of attention to where this particular seam is because it's not concealed by a piece of trim. So I had to make sure I epoxy coated that thoroughly and had a nice build on it to conceal that seam. You'll notice that the coloration of this brown isn't really ideal, and it certainly is not consistent. It's dependent upon the texture underneath in the core material of the PLA itself and how it was 3D printed. So you can see different colorations, and you can actually see patterns in the printing process. Now this is, of course, inside. As you sand it, you're removing the top layer, and you're kind of seeing inside the 3D printed material. But either way, however you look at it, it's not a consistent, homogeneous color. Plus, it's not the color that I want. Now, the black obviously is the color that I want. But again, with the 3D printing process, the infill can show through. The layer lines might come to the surface where you can see them, things of that nature. So just clear coating them might work, but then again, it might not work. So what I'm going to go through is I'm going to go through a primer, and then I'm going to color coat each of the components to their appropriate color, my desired color, and then we'll clear coat it at the end. And the material that I'm going to use, I do not believe requires any sanding in between. So hopefully it's going to be a nice, quick process. Now, one more thing about the color, and hopefully this will show up on the camera pretty well, but this is the back panel, and normally most manufacturers would just have a flat black cardboard or hardboard material back there. Of course, ours is 3D printed, and it's sanded very, very smooth. Everything, the seams are hidden well, but again, variations in color. So it's going to get the same treatment everything else would. It's going to get spray painted black, and then it's going to get a clear coat. In keeping with the style of the radio, this goes back to the 40s, roughly maybe the 50s. The original material of a clock like this would have been a Bakelite material, basically the first version of plastics. And it was used in a lot of consumer and industrial goods back in the time. Now, there wasn't a lot of color choices with that Bakelite initially, and a lot of the old clocks and old radios had, I call it commonly just simply Bakelite brown and Bakelite black. And it was a pretty distinct color, and it was pretty common. So I'm trying to replicate that to a certain degree. And the material I'm using, or the product I'm using, is the paints from Createx. This company produces water-based paints, and I used them on another project, the Raspberry Pi camera demonstrator project. And boy, it was just a pleasure working with this paint. It dries fast, it's non-toxic, it doesn't stink, it sprays pretty darn easily. Even though I've only done one thing with it, I found it to spray very nicely. It coats, the paints got enough opacity to them to coat nicely. Pretty much there's not a lot of negatives on it that I've found so far, but you never know. This whole project could go south on me during this process. But I'm trying to decide between the two browns that I've got shown here. This one is their Wicked Colors line, and this color is called Detail Burnt Umber. And I don't know if the camera's picking it up good enough or not, but it's a nice dark, rich, chocolatey brown. The other one that I've got, it's also part of their Wicked Colors line, is called Wicked Brown. Wicked Colors, Wicked Brown, I guess that's how they work it. It's a good color, and I think it really closely matches the Bakelite brown that I'm thinking of. But when I was doing a lot of the 3D rendering and modeling of this radio, I really like the darker brown better. So I'm going to do a little test spray of both colors, see which one I like, and that's the one I'll go with. And I'll let you know later on. And for the black pieces, it's simply opaque black. Their color number is 5211 for that. Now, the process with this paint, this water-based paint, is certainly different. Createx is really doing some amazing things with their product, and I'm hoping that everything is going to work out very good. Now, the interesting thing is, there's a product, or part of their product line, called UVLS Clear. And this is really their go-to clear coat. But what's really interesting about this is it is also a primer. This is their recommended base coat or primer coat where you want high adhesion. And in our case, we've got already the right base colors, the brown and the black, for our top colors. So having a clear primer coat, so to speak, is really kind of an interesting trick, I'm going to say. This is, again, water-based. It's an acrylic-type polyurethane paint, so it's going to harden very tough. It's going to be a very, very good, durable top coat. And after watching a lot of their videos, it seems to spray great, work great. I've heard it sands very well if you need to do a real light sanding between your primer coat and your color coats. Now, I'll use this for the primer, and I'll use it for the top coat, the clear coat, at the very end of the whole process. So this is going to be kind of interesting. And what I kind of really like about this, once I spray this on and it dries after about 10-15 minutes, I can see how all the texture of all the material is going to be. So there really won't be anything hidden by the color of the primer, like a dark gray or a dark black or a red oxide primer. So this might be very telling, giving you any clues as to potential problems when you get to the end of the paint job. Now, you might be wondering why I want to paint this when it's already the right color. Well, 3D printed materials do not provide a consistent color through the process, and that's somewhat controlled by your infill, your number of skin coats or number of skin layers and so forth. This has 3, maybe 4 skin layers or outer layers, and then it's 60% infill. Now, if I tilt this forward, I don't know if you're going to be able to see it, but you can actually see all the little infill lines, so to speak. You'll see them as darker, where the holes between the infill lines is a lighter color. So it's actually got a weird pattern in it. You can't feel it at all, but you can certainly see it. So by putting a color coat over that, you bring consistency to all the color of it. Same thing with black. The black may look black, and it'll probably look pretty decent with just a clear coat on it, but I want a more consistent black color for these overall trim pieces. Now for painting, these pieces, this trim and the bezel, these will be mounted on a little wooden stick, and I'll be painting these separately. The back panel will just get paint on one side. That'll be painted separately. But what I've found is I want these two pieces assembled together, the base with the body of the clock, or the housing of the radio, I'm sorry. And the reason being, this area here, when you attach the body to the base, you're going to slide it across that surface, and you're most probably going to scratch it up if it's a high gloss, well-painted surface. So I'm recommending to assemble these together. I'm going to paint the brown first. I'll mask off the brown, and then I'll spray the black. I'll remove all the masking, and then I'll clear coat it. Mine fit together very snugly. I fit it by sanding the bottom of the clock body, the radio body. I've sanded that down until it would fit and slide in snugly. I really only need a couple of drops of glue on the inside along this area to hold it together. So with that, that goes over all the preparation steps, my color choice, my paint choice, and how I plan to go about painting it. Now what we'll do, we'll head over to my little miniature spray booth, and we'll start getting everything painted up and see how it works. Now I've mixed up the paint following the manufacturer's recommendations. I'm using their 4012 reducer, and again, this is the 4050 gloss. Now I mix it up in a little cup like this, and this is one of those projects that I'm using an airbrush, and I probably should be using a bigger gun than the brush, but this is the best tool I've got available to me at this time. So I'm going to have to thin it out a little bit more so that I can get a decent flow out of the gun, so when I spray it on, I get a wet, medium wet flow and spray on the part. You don't want it to spray out like it's almost dry and it's real pebbly, and you don't want it runny. So kind of this medium wet coat is going to give you your best adhesion and so forth. I already sprayed this particular piece, and that's good. Mixing, anytime you mix their paints, they seem to always recommend stirring them for a minimum of a minute. So I'm going to take that advice. Most of us don't have the patience, but I think it's important that we force ourselves into it. So from here, we'll go ahead, and I'm going to start with just a couple of the small pieces. I'll get those sprayed, and then we'll move on to the larger pieces. Now with our clear primer coat dried, and it's only really been about 15 minutes or so, we're ready to move on to the top color coat. And in this case, of course, it's going to be black. Again, mix that up and reduce it to flow through your paint gun. For me, I'm actually reducing it quite a bit to flow through my Iwata, we call that a Revolution CR gun. And again, like I say, this is probably on the small end of a spray gun for this particular project. But we'll just spray it the same way I did with the clear primer coat. Just flow it on, go for a medium wet spray. Now I'm going to move on to the brown color, and of course I'm going to paint all this at once. I'll have to mask off the brown after it dries and then respray the bottom so that it's black. Now the brown that I went with was Detail Burnt Umber, their color number 0069. I'm hoping it's the right choice. We'll find out. If not, I can always paint it the other brown. Colors all mixed up, thinned out to flow through my airbrush. So now I'm just going to start spraying again. Well, as I was afraid of, the paint job went south, and it went south really, really bad. I messed up. It was all on me. I was spraying on the second coat of the burnt umber and not really keeping it in my mind that that's actually a transparent paint. It doesn't have a lot of body to it, so its coverage is very slow. So I tried to force it, oversprayed it, got it way too wet, and this is what it looks like when you do that. Hiked up my big boy panties and decided, well, let's start sanding. So I sanded the surface back down, got it good and even again. I then sprayed a coat of the black base coat material on it. That's also a Createx product, so that it'd have an even base, and it also has a lot of body so you can kind of sand it out again a little bit more. I followed that then with a custom mixed solid color, a solid pigment color. They call it opaque paints, and it's in their airbrush colors. So I came up with a brown mixed up out of primarily just black and red. I tried a couple other mixes and settled on that as close enough brown to get me a good base coat. So I sprayed that on. I applied 2 coats of that, looking for just consistency. I really wasn't too concerned about the actual color of it as much as I was worried about consistency. So after that dried up real good, then I went back to the burnt umber, remembering that it's a translucent paint, and I sprayed on 2 dry to medium wet coats with it and patiently sprayed it on, and that brought the color right to where I wanted it. So that's how I saved the paint job. It took me almost a whole day to fix it, but is what it is. That's part of the process of making stuff yourself. Sometimes you get sidetracked and mess things up, and you got to fix them. After all these paints dried, I sprayed on 3 coats of the 4050 Gloss Clear. And that, I actually waited a couple hours after the color coats had dried. So I got that sprayed on, and at this point, that's where we're at. A little bit later, we'll go into doing a little bit of sanding on it, and then polishing and waxing. I looked around for some knobs that didn't have indicator marks on them, such as these white lines you see on the knobs here. Couldn't find them, so I gave up the search, bought what I could find on eBay, or I'm sorry, on Amazon, and so I figured a little bit of gloss black paint might fix that problem for me. After that, we're going to use rubbing compound, following the manufacturer's directions. Just put a dollop on a rag, rub it in, keep working it and polishing until it dries to a dull haze. Take a fresh, clean terry cloth, polish off the excess, cleaning all the residue away. From there, I'm going to move on to a car wax. Here I'm using turtle wax in this example, or in this case. I've used it for many years, done me good. There you apply that with a wet terry cloth, barely wet I should say. You'll wring out all the water after wetting it, so it's just basically damp. You'll apply that to the surface, rubbing it in, following generally a circular motion if you can. Rub it in till it hazes over, let it dry for a little bit more, take a fresh terry cloth and polish it up really good. After all that's done, clean up all the leftover little pieces of wax that are in the corners everywhere. Get that cleaned up, and then we're going to move into assembly. Well, that wraps up this segment on our radio project. Hopefully it wasn't too bad, and again, if you're more comfortable using different paints or different finishing methods for 3D printed materials, feel free to have at it. You don't have to follow the technique, the colors, or anything that I've demonstrated here. I'm just showing you how I did it in the look I was going for and trying to replicate something from about 80 years ago. So thanks again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.